When you think of themed restaurants in Los Angeles today, you can probably only name a few. Medieval Times, the Rainforest Cafe, Disneyland, that pirate one that I don't even know what the name of it is. All of these are national chains, though. Not many out there are local individual businesses. But a century ago, unique themed cafes, restaurants, and other local businesses were a staple of Los Angeles. A combination of car culture and the movie industry collided to create the perfect environment for the rise of stuff like all of this. A cream can ice cream shop, a flower pot flower shop, a boat restaurant with a dragon scaling a tower, a Hollywood restaurant shaped like a derby hat, and a fish restaurant that beckons you to enter through the gaping maw of a whale. There were hundreds of these around the city and in the valley, but where did they go? Well, to answer that question, we need to figure out how LA got here. And to do that, we need to go way back. Yeah, we need to go way back. It's kind of the only way to figure out why LA is the way it is. Before the city existed, the LA Basin was occupied for thousands and thousands of years by, of course, the native people, the Tongva tribe, and in the San Fernando Valley, it was the Tataviam tribe. Although, I should note here that the name Tongva was originally recorded in 1903 by a member of the tribe named Mrs. James Rosemeyer. Since the members of the tribe typically referred to themselves in relation to the village they lived in, rather than a national-type name, Mrs. James Rosemeyer was referring to her own village. In recent years, many indigenous people of the Los Angeles area have accepted the name Tongva, or Gabrieleño. During the time of the missions, many native people who were slave laborers at Mission San Gabriel referred to themselves as Quiche. Once established by the Spanish missionaries, LA grew pretty little in size from its inception in the year 1781 as El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Angeles, set up in close proximity to the Tongva village of Yangna, which was located around what is now the LA Civic Center. The new town relied on Yangna for slave labor until 1851, when a German immigrant bought the land and displaced the entire village, who had been living there for thousands of years. After this, LA grew into mostly a farming community. It attained slow growth up until the gold rush, which was kind of an economic boom for all of the West Coast. In the mid-1860s, a massive drought kind of destroyed the entire Southern California economy. It was also the end of the gold rush boom. The city began hemorrhaging its population, causing the land values to tank and the San Francisco bankers to foreclose the loans they had made to the rancheros back when beef was considered the gold of the South. LA had nothing left but land, sunshine, and fresh air, and it was these things that the developers of the city turned to market it to newcomers. For the first time, a city's entire growth hinged not on its wealth, but on the dream of a relaxed life in the sun. LA wanted to be different from the tight-knit, very congested cities of New York and Chicago. People living there were sick of the dirtiness and the crowdedness and general bad health that they got from living in a city like that. LA was marketed as a place of clean air and sunshine and open land, and definitely not the forced removal of the native people that already lived there. But people emigrating to Los Angeles in the late 19th century were looking for a new lease on life, and that's something that LA could provide. So in the early 20th century, there became a lot of argument over height limits and how the city was going to be set up, and they really wanted it to be the antithesis to everything that New York and Chicago was. LA actually ended up being populated a lot with the sick and infirmed because of these marketing tactics that advertised LA as a place of healing. It had one of the highest concentrations of sanitariums in the country. It became known as the Sanitarium Belt. The city became flooded with people not only of weak health. One Dr. Peter Remendino declared, "From my personal observations, I can say that at least an extra 10 years lease on life is gained by a removal to this coast from the eastern states. Not 10 years to be added with its extra weight of age and infirmity, but 10 years more with an additional benefit of feeling 10 years younger during the time." Bold claims here from a doctor who worked in the age of medicines that were mostly comprised of alcohol, cocaine, opium, and weed. And whatever benefits from the climate existed then, they sure don't exist now. The temperature in LA this week got to over 110 degrees, and LA is also completely on fire along with the rest of the West Coast, and I've been choking on smoke this whole week, and I'm dying. LA then began to attract a large number of Midwestern immigrants who were lured in by the $1 fare price that was the result of a fare war between the railroad companies. These immigrants brought with them, as the writer Willard Huntington Wright wrote in the 1910s, a complete stock of rural beliefs, pieties, superstitions, and habits, along with a righteous abhorrence of shapely legs and an aversion to late dinners, malt liquors, grand opera, and hussies. When cities like New York came into being, people couldn't really travel long distances, so walking to work and shopping was kind of the only way to get around. LA's second wave of immigration exploded around the time of the development of streetcar lines and the advent of the automobile, so the layout of the city followed suit. And because the city had no central design team to determine its look, the neighborhoods were left to the whims of the individual developers and their tight budgets. As LA was being developed more and more around the turn of the century, rail lines and trolleys were being built that enabled people to build their homes on the very edges of the city. The original idea was that LA would be this collection of little urban enclaves that were connected by the streetcar lines, and in between would be beautiful, untouched nature. We all know what happened to that. If you need someone to blame, look no further than Henry Huntington. Yes, Huntington as in Huntington Beach and the Huntington Library and Gardens. Henry Huntington was the favorite nephew of railroad magnate Collis Huntington. With his overloaded bank account and eye for how to load it more, he came in to develop the rail line. He would basically pick a spot practically in the middle of nowhere, name the area, and build a rail line linking the main system to the new area. And then, from there, the area would develop into its own little city. The streetcar line was owned and operated by Pacific Electric, which Huntington was vice president of for 8 years. The Pacific Electric cars, or red cars, became iconic to Los Angeles, and were the main mode of transportation. This was the real push that resulted in the SoCal sprawl. The Pacific Electric streetcar system was not a publicly owned and operated public transportation system. It was a private company, easily bought and easily outgrown. Its private investors saw no value in it once the real estate development had taken off. LA's population had grown far beyond what PE could handle, and people riding the trolleys began to become frustrated. The cars were running off schedule, or were late, the drivers were drunk, and they couldn't hold the crowds, and the cars became dirty. It's not like these were unfixable problems. Instead of the city developing a more advanced public transportation system, they let it die and leaned into cars. After all, there was an appeal in the freedom of a car that you can take where you want to go, as opposed to the limitations of a streetcar that only takes you to predetermined stations. As Pacific Electric died, it was sent into the grave very unceremoniously. Many of the rail lines were detonated or simply paved over, and the red cars were burned. You can still visit some of the streetcars today, as well as their stations, or you can see the old tracks peeking out from the undergrowth. The car itself wasn't really responsible for the sprawl of LA. That had already been put in place by the streetcar lines, but the car did decentralize the city. This urban sprawl and the growth of the car's place in the lives of LA residents paved the way for programmatic architecture, a building type that uses the mimetic or sculptural form of the building to communicate its contents. LA didn't invent programmatic architecture. In fact, the first example of it in America is actually Lucy the Elephant. In 1881, James Lafferty built a huge tin-plated pachyderm topped by a canopied howdah to attract customers to his real estate business in Margate, New Jersey. Lafferty took clients up the howdah to view land offerings and used the inside of Lucy for his offices. By all standards, the Statue of Liberty counts as programmatic architecture too. Amusement parks became so popular around the turn of the century that when Chicago's 1893 World's Columbian Exposition was being planned, the Exposition Committee made sure that an entire area of the fair should be essentially an amusement park. The Midway offered the first Ferris wheel, early movies, and a cartoonish construction of a street in Cairo, in which paying visitors could walk in replicas of Egyptian alleys and watch belly dances and wedding processions. World's fairs became the testing grounds for new construction materials such as gunite, spray paint, and neon lights, all of which became staples later of the novelty roadside attractions. The most important link between World's Fairs and programmatic architecture came during the San Francisco Pan-Pacific International Exposition of 1915, in which D.W. Griffith hired plaster workers to recreate an ancient Babylon for his film Intolerance. The set remained sitting around and highly visible by LA residents for a long time after shooting wrapped. So obviously the link between Hollywood and amusement parks, and therefore LA, was already laid out. LA may not have invented programmatic buildings, but it certainly mastered the art. California's reputation was built around this idea that anything is possible, the wildest dreams of your imagination. So it wasn't a far stretch to go from the dream of movies to the fantasy of a restaurant shaped like a derby hat, or a tamale cafe shaped like a tamale. This culture of fantasy in LA merged with the budding car culture. William Irwin Thompson wrote in his essay, Looking for History in LA, Disneyland is not an anomaly contained by Anaheim, but a gathering and concentration of the Southern California worldview. In a city full of any and every identity, there can be no collective culture. The one collective culture that does emerge reflects that chaos and irregularity. Buildings can be everything and anything. In this climate, architects began building any wacky project that the client wanted, so long as they could pay for it. And then the city began to reflect more a Hollywood backlot than a normal city. Many of these architects worked in Hollywood, building sets and props. James M. Cain wrote home about LA, saying, "There is no reward for aesthetic virtue here, no punishment for aesthetic crime." Many writers who moved to LA viewed the landscape as something almost demonic, anarchy even. It gave them the impression that people in Los Angeles must be hiding something sinister within their souls, some sort of dark despair that they mask with the absurdity. It was really, of course, not as serious as that. People just like silly things. People like to have fun. And the people who built these buildings needed to get people's attention. And honestly, it's beyond me why so many people moved to LA, a place that was already famous for being outlandish and weird, and then once they got there, became offended by the orange juice stands shaped like oranges or whatever. LA saw a massive explosion in the number of programmatic buildings in the city after the wild success of the Brown Derby restaurant in 1926. These buildings catered to the rise of car culture in LA, and the fact that people both had to commute longer and longer distances, and were looking to cars as the main way for them to get out and enjoy themselves, when the newly established 5-day workweek suddenly provided people with a lot more leisure time. Programmatic buildings sought to be large, loud, and easy to quickly interpret while driving. They could easily pull drivers off the roads and into their parking lots. These buildings functioned as tourist destinations as well, a few of them gaining national fame. There was a lot of competition for your attention on the road. You had to worry about shifting gears, you had to worry about the slow horse-drawn vehicle in front of you, so it took a lot to pull your gaze. Let's take a brief tour of some of the most famous joints of this era, shall we? I'll start off with my personal favorite, the Hoot Hoot Ice Cream Parlor. Established in 1926 by Tilly Hattrip and built by her husband Roy, the Hoot Hoot ice cream stand ran for 50 years, but was tragically demolished in 1979 after being moved from Rosemead to Long Beach and then to Southgate. The owl's head spun around, and the eyes, which were made from Buick headlamps, blinked and glowed at night. The Brown Derby. This was the place to see and be seen for a Hollywood star. The Cobb salad was invented here because, well, it was owned by the Cobb family. Because so many people went there to see celebrities, the restaurant covered the walls in celebrity caricature drawings. In its heyday, you might have had the chance to dine there and see anyone from Harold Lloyd to Groucho Marx to William Holden or Carole Lombard. The Mushroom Cafe. The Mushroom Cafe was, well, a cafe shaped like a giant mushroom in Burbank. That's pretty much the extent of it. The Pig Cafe. Located near La Brea and Rosewood Avenue, this joint served up sandwiches and other fast food. Let's be real here, the menus didn't vary that much between places. The Pup and Bulldog Cafes. The Pup went from this in 1930 to this in 1940. Its older cousin was the Bulldog Cafe, which was for a long time immortalized as a replica in the Peterson Automotive Museum, since its untimely demise in 1966. The Idle Hour Cafe. Built by Michael D. Connolly, a film tech at Universal, the Idle Hour was built close to the studio to serve the film workers. It was bought and turned into a flamenco bar called La Caña in the 70s, before falling into disrepair. Since most of the LA residents who were frequenting these joints were newly established Midwesterners, they weren't exactly ready for anything too exotic. Almost universally, the menus consisted of basic white staples such as chili, steaks, chicken, burgers, and coleslaw, even if the setting around you looked like a Polynesian island, like, for example, Clifton's Cafe. Much like the Hollywood films they reflected, many of the more theatrical themed restaurants ended up being more than a little racist, like the Zulu Hut in Studio City, for instance, enforcing harmful stereotypes to the patrons that went there for a thrill. But for the most part, most of the joints stayed fairly innocent, just a massive flower pot, or a giant donut, or Mother Goose's Boot restaurant. Most LA residents weren't interested in eating in a pirate ship where the owner whipped the crew, and female patrons were abducted and held hostage until they screamed. Most people just wanted the micro thrill of drinking orange juice out of a giant orange, or getting gas underneath a real giant airplane. The problem is, it's always been known that LA sits on land that is just constantly waiting for natural disasters. I mean, look at what's happening right now. Fire, landslide, earthquake, flood, but most residents live not thinking about it too much less preparing in any meaningful way. So LA is a city well aware of its liminality, of its fleetingness. So it's also a city pretty much untethered by tradition the way that many East Coast cities are, and therefore it has very little qualms demolishing its historical landmarks. Post-war LA was a city aching to grow up and leave behind the whimsy of its childhood. Buildings and homes became boxier, more sleek, and less decorated, and many of the old novelty icons began to disappear. Many of them actually didn't survive through the Great Depression. The federal government had poured billions and billions of dollars into the city's industries during the war, and the city as a whole saw a big uptick in its job availability as those industries managed to stay booming after the war. This attracted a massive influx in immigration from all over, and a large number of soldiers stayed in LA after being discharged. These people were looking for a place to set down roots and live happily in the sun, similar to the population boom of the 10s and 20s. The city needed to build lots of housing, lots of it, fast and cheap. Thousands of tract homes sprang up seemingly overnight, all nearly identical and without a whole lot of personality. The homogeneous image overran the aesthetic crime of before and replaced it with a different aesthetic crime. These new buildings were done out of a great necessity, pushed forward by a rapid change in the city's general taste, and not really out of passion. Whereas in the 20s, these programmatic buildings were built to visually represent on a large scale what the businesses were selling, storefronts later became far more unassuming so as to blend into the landscape, and buildings courting automobile drivers shifted almost entirely into the realm of drive-ins and gas stations, as well as the Googie diners of the 50s and 60s. In the 1970s, the LA Fire Department ruled that all buildings over 150 feet needed to have a helipad on top of them, resulting in a flat-topped skyline with few architecturally creative buildings. The new standards as a whole were so specific that city planners say once architects finally pieced together a compliant design, they replicated it over and over. LA's drift towards monochromatic, seemingly soulless architecture was not limited to public or business architecture. It impacted residential buildings and homes too. But there's an argument there that the change in the look of the LA home was more out of necessity than anything else. It served a great need, and it saved money and time. Mid-century apartment styles like the ever-common dingbat did their best to get creative with their simplistic templates, incorporating colors, interesting ornamentation, and each having a unique name, as if the buildings themselves are Hollywood stars. Many more recent apartment buildings still stick to the blocky and wedding cake structures, but make an almost feeble attempt at character by slapping a bright color here and there. The City of Cerritos Residential Design Manual, for example, lists a long slew of aesthetic do's and don'ts, enforcing the city's monolithic style. Architects in the 1970s became openly hostile to more garish styles of architecture. This, combined with the overwhelming number of cars, smog, expanse, and both natural and man-made disasters over time, jaded people's image of LA. By the late 70s, they began to see it as almost a nightmare rather than a dream. The promise of a better, healthier life from the days of the sanitarium belt paradise got lost somewhere along the line, and with it, much of the city's ability to be playful. Here's a selection of some pretty telling quotes from a 1986 LA Times article. "It is depressing to contemplate the raucous ugliness which is taking over our land. Every new highway built across our land seems to be an invitation to string out more honky-tonk developments. Too often the new space opened in the city seems to invite further vulgarity. It's atrocious design, phony, dated, child-oriented trash." Ooh, trash, you say? You heard it here first, folks. Adults are not allowed to have fun. Much of LA's programmatic history now only survives in Disneyland and Disney California Adventure, where places like the Darkroom have been recreated. Disneyland itself is a park entirely composed of programmatic architecture. Main Street USA is not truly a main street, but a construction meant to emulate one, the idea of one. Famous clown Michael Eisner commissioned a massive imitation of Mickey's wizard hat from Fantasia to be built at the Disney Animation Studio in Burbank, so large it can be seen from the nearby freeway. A true throwback to the early days when being seen from the road was the whole point. Richard Shave, a bus-driving historian for Esotouric Tours, says, "The world is becoming a checkerboard on which corporations take out little pieces and implement their brand strategies. Programmatic architecture are these brilliant expressions of individuals who came to Los Angeles to make their fortune selling hamburgers and orange juice on the side of the road. It is literally this frozen-in-time snapshot of pre-World War II zeitgeist of Los Angeles. This is our cultural heritage." Whereas before, people came to LA seeking space and distance and isolation, people now in LA are increasingly craving that closeness and community that tight-knit cities offer. Many LA residents are frustrated with the fractured city and how long it takes to get from point A to point B anywhere. There is no rush hour because every hour is rush hour. People are also frustrated with the way that the city transformed in the 70s through the 90s, what architectural historian and critic Christopher Hawthorne calls the second LA. People crave that whimsy once again. This is the third LA. In 2010, Los Angeles designated the Idle Hour a historical cultural monument. It was purchased in 2015 by the 1933 group, who restored it to its original glory, and included a replica of the 1928 Bulldog Cafe, salvaged from the Peterson Automotive Museum in the Beer Garden. They intend to get the original Tale of the Pup back in business too, as long as they snag a good location for it after its many years imprisoned in a Torrance warehouse. But what other novelty joints are left behind? Well, Randy's Donuts is still there near LAX, probably due to its Hollywood fame. 4 of the original Chili Bowl restaurants are still standing, but you may not recognize them. The Wigwam Motel is unfortunately still there and operating in San Bernardino, and was immortalized as a traffic cone motel in Disney's Cars and in Cars Land at Disney California Adventure. The Jail Cafe is still around too, now the location of the Silver Lake restaurant El Cid. The Dark Room is now home to the Spare Tire Kitchen and Tavern. The Brown Derby was inelegantly slated to be demolished, gaining a bad dent before being saved at the last minute. It now lives in the depths of K-Town Mall, the Brown Derby Plaza. The Tamale's still there too, and most recently housed a beauty parlor. The Coffee Pot Cafe, which was described by locals as an eyesore and neighborhood blight, is now an LGBTQ-run hair salon and community center called the Benders Collective. History really does judge all architecture on a curve, though. Back in the Edwardian era, the craftsman bungalows that people in LA find so charming now were scoffed at. This is a quote from Richard Moeller, the associate professor of architecture at the University of Washington. Many of these houses were the same, and many were completely identical to each other because they were being built by a single developer. At the time, it was criticized for wasting land and looking the same. Looking identical today means neighborhood character. If it's old and looks the same, it's good. But if it's new and looks the same, it's bad. People today have very little love for the monolithic architecture that came out of the 70s to 90s all the way through today. But how will people feel about these modern styles 50 to 100 years from now? if we live that long. Will they be emblematic of our particular moment in time? A nostalgic and sympathetic memory? Right now, much in the way that the architects of the 70s were hostile and antagonistic towards Googie and Novelty architecture, many people today feel the same way about their work. Will the attitudes swing back up? Spending any time watching HGTV will tell you that, at least for mid-century homes, the answer is a tentative yes. Many HGTV shows will usually involve the host taking over a mid-century tract home and lauding its retro charms, but then turn around and tear down those same characteristics, replacing them with a 2010s crate and barrel chic. But I guess I can't fault them too much. Most new home buyers don't exactly want to live in a time capsule, and mid-century tract homes are most of what LA has to work with. My tastes are not universal. But as far as public architecture goes, it's almost impossible to tell at this point. Unlike a lot of those blocky, stucco-laden buildings built in the late 1900s, Googie and Novelty architecture had a lot of people during their time who were deeply passionate about them. They represented creativity and fun and excitement about the future. The Sputnik era of space exploration was embodied within their design. Much of the architecture that came later was more of a means to an end, serving a need and doing it on both a budget and a timeline. Most people were fairly indifferent. But in a city like Los Angeles, I guess you can't fault them too much for having to fill that need in the way it was filled. The city's residents have done their best to dress up those empty boxes with murals and public art done by individuals. If you know where to look, LA is a city that's very good at dressing itself. This is a quote from Greg Golden, the curator of the A&D Architecture and Design Museum of Los Angeles. Typically, the facades have all but disappeared. What was once an undulating zigzag modern market, or a vaguely Rococo Spanish colonial revival restaurant, or an ordinary concrete block auto repair, has now metamorphosed into a laundromat, or a pawn shop, or a storefront church. This is architecture as it was once understood in the early New England village and in the original Spanish land grant. It is not a time capsule or a shrine. It is an evolving collection of places in which citizens engage one another within a world of their shared making. This kind of architecture is about settling in, adapting, and accommodating a shift from one set of aims and hopes to the desires of another. I want to bring us full circle here at the end and bring it back around to talking about the Tongva people. Despite the efforts of the Spanish missionaries and the American genocide mandates that came after California's annexation into the US in the 1850s, the Tongva people are still here. A few thousand Tongva people live in LA today, keeping their history alive despite a culture that very much wants to believe that they're a thing of the past. If you love LA at all, you need to love its original people too. I'll be putting some links in the description where you can learn more about the Tongva people and the history of Young Na. Thank you for watching and learning a bit, maybe a lot, about LA's weird architectural history with me. Completely unrelated, but if you like reading webcomics, maybe read the one that I make. I work really hard on it. It's called Cunning Fire. It's an urban fantasy webcomic, and it updates on Mondays and Thursdays at cunningfire.com or on Tapas. And also Line Webtoon, but not as frequently updated on there. If you want to learn more, I have a whole list of my sources down in the description.